The Minister who's just resumed his seat has misrepresented the Labour Party position in a number of ways, and I don't, in this first call, have a chance to respond to all of the accusations that he made as to the Labour Party position, which were incorrect. I think history shows that through the 30 years that the ACC system has been, or over 30 years that we've had it in New Zealand, that the Labour Party has consistently stood by the principles that lay behind its foundation because they are fair, and we continue to do so. The Minister made it clear that his justification for the changes that are made to the scheme is that it costs too much as it is and therefore cannot be afforded. And yet, not one submitter, and the department and neither did the department in their original submission to the committee, present any evidence to the Select Committee to show that it is more expensive for employers than it is for employers in overseas schemes. And indeed, it took the opposition questions of officials to actually get some information as to cost comparisons. Now, you'd think that if cost was being the justification, or being used as the justification for drastically reducing the entitlements that people have and need following an accident in New Zealand, you'd think that if that was the basis of the justification for these changes, that there would be robust information provided to the Select Committee, and there wasn't. I was also disappointed that the business submitters, like Business New Zealand, and I name them not to be pejorative about them. I value them making submissions to Select Committee, but neither they nor any other business representative making submissions to Select Committee gave us any information as to comparative costs. And that surprised me and saddened me, because amongst their members are multinational companies that operate not just in New Zealand but also in Australia and Canada and other jurisdictions around the world, and they would have, if they desired to get it through their contacts, information as to the relative costs in New Zealand and overseas. And you cannot but conclude from their failure to do so, you can't conclude anything but that the New Zealand scheme, even in its present state, is cheaper than alternatives overseas. And we explored that a bit through the officials. We had the officials provide us the best information they had as to comparisons with Australia. This came from information that was presented to the Workplace Relations Ministers' Council in 2008, which I understand is a meeting between Australian and New Zealand officials. And it showed that the cost per $100 of earnings in Australia are significantly higher in 06-07 than they are in New Zealand. That year was chosen because I think it's the last date that they have comparable information for, but the average for Australia was $1.73 per $100 of earnings, whereas in New Zealand it's 94 cents per $100 of earnings. Now,
and what does it exclude?
That excludes motor vehicle accidents on both sides of on both sides of the Tasman. It is full costing. In terms of the advice that officials gave us, it was full costing of the year. Full costing for the year of claims in the 06-07 year. It excluded the tail. It excluded the tail.
Oh.
The tail, of course, Dr. Smith, if you don't already understand this, and you say, using the microphone to your advantage, as you're not meant to do in the chair, but it does exclude the historic tail, because, of course, the historic tail is a different pool to be funded. But in terms of the full cost of 06-07 accidents, they were meant to be fully paid in New Zealand at 94 cents, and the comparative cost was $1.73 per $100 of earnings. So where is the justification for reducing entitlements compared with Australia? We hear from the government that New Zealand is always a poor performer compared with Australia. And in some areas that's true, but in the area of accident compensation it's not. We have a more efficient scheme. It is cheaper to administer. We know from the Pricewaterhouse report, and again the Select Committee had this information, that the administrative costs of the ACC scheme are amongst the lowest, if not the lowest, in the world, and that's one of the reasons why ACC levies are lower compared with the service that's provided than is the case in overseas jurisdictions. We know that at least currently doesn't make a profit, Mr. Chairman.
David Parker.
At present, the government-owned Accident Compensation Corporation is the provider of cover for risk. It doesn't make a profit. It covers its cost, including the full costs of accidents. It does cover the full cost of its accidents. There is a problem in New Zealand with a declining rate of rehabilitation. That's a matter that the Minister referred to. I acknowledge that. Rehabilitation rates for long-term injuries have declined at approximately 1% per annum over recent years. That's a trend that is true also in overseas jurisdictions. We know that it's in part a consequence of ageing populations. As people age, they both break easier and they take longer to recover after they are injured. Both of those things are realities. That doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't strive to do even better in terms of achieving better rehabilitation rates, and the Labour Party certainly doesn't oppose measures to improve rehabilitation rates. But nonetheless, it remains true that costs for employers are significantly lower per $100 of earnings in New Zealand than in Australia. Of course, Australians earn higher wages as well, but I'm not making a comparison on total wages. I'm making it for that reason on the basis of per $100 of earnings, and even on that base, rates are lower for New Zealand employers. So how, Minister, can it be justified to decrease further the rates for New Zealand employers, effectively at the cost of injured people and at the cost of the state? Because we already know that even under existing rules, many of the people who are exited from the ACC scheme end up on unemployment benefits at a cost to taxpayers rather than employers. We already know that many of the people who are exited from the scheme don't get back into work and are left languishing on benefits. Now, no system's perfect. We readily acknowledge that there are always ways in which the scheme can be improved, but there is no justification for changing the threshold from 35 hours per week to 30 hours per week. That's the number of hours at which someone will be deemed to be work ready for full-time work. Goes down from currently they have to be able to work 35 hours a week. That goes down for 30 hours per week, and this will be amplified by other contributions later, in concert with the fact that now ACC will not have to have regard to pre-accident earnings. Effectively, someone could be earning quite a good income on a salary. The example given by a submitter was a bank teller. They might suffer an occupational overuse injury. They can't work for some period. The bank needs someone to fulfil their role, and so they're laid off their work. They're reliant on ACC. They can be pushed off the ACC scheme when they're work ready by being deemed to be work ready because they can work for 30 hours per week, even if they were working 40 hours per week previously, and they can have, now ACC will no longer have to have regard to their pre-accident earnings, so effectively they could be forced off the scheme when they're able to be a shelf stacker at a supermarket or something like that, working for the minimum wage. Of course, the levies will go down for the employer, but the level of compensation received by the injured worker will be completely inadequate and is unjustified.
Oh, Mr. Chairman.
Honourable Nick Smith.
Mr. Chairman, I want to gun straight down into the debate